Welcome to Alignment, using your values to invest in social change, brought to you by Oikocredit US. We're proud to bring you this fourth in our series of interviews with experts in the field of values-based investing. I'm Matt Eldridge, CEO of Oikocredit US.
And I'm Sara, Shoff, Chief Operating Officer of Oikocredit US. We're delighted to have as our special guest today, Dr. Stephanie Gripne, founder and CEO of the Impact Finance Center, a multi-university, nonprofit academic center that identifies, trains, and activates philanthropists and investors to become impact investors. Before we introduce Dr. Gripne, just a word about who we are. Oikocredit US is the nonprofit US affiliate of Oikocredit International, a 45-year-old global cooperative that works to improve living conditions in low-income countries. Oikocredit does so by investing in microfinance and small and medium enterprises in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Our job here at Oikocredit US is to raise awareness and financial support in North America for these efforts.
We're thrilled today to speak with Stephanie, described by Forbes as the Steve Jobs of impact investing. She is an academic entrepreneur, impact investor, researcher, educator, and the creative force behind the Impact Finance Center, Impact Investing Institute, investor clubs, impact investing giving circles, and who's who in impact investing. Moreover, Stephanie is the driving force behind the national impact investing marketplace to catalyze $1 trillion of investment. Steph, thanks for joining us. We're so happy to speak with you today.
Matt and Sara, I'm thrilled to be with you today.
Stephanie, I've had the pleasure of knowing you since 2016 and serving on the board of Realize Impact together. One of my earliest memories of you was when you spoke in Seattle to a room full of foundations, family foundations, and individual investors. Your remarks struck me because so often in impact investing, things are described in terms that are either all head or all heart. Either there's higher level math and multivariate equations, or it's all about case studies like Janice, the cow farmer in Uganda who needs a loan to start selling yogurt and expand her business. Rarely do I hear someone who can talk about impact investing in a way that's both easy to understand and rigorously compelling. You challenge people in that room to question the conventional notion of only using philanthropic dollars to do good. You asked, why not use the full spectrum of your assets to achieve impact? For our viewers who weren't in that room that day, what do you mean by full spectrum capital?
Thank you for that question, Matt. And it's so funny. You asking me that question brought me back to that moment in time. What the audience didn't know when I was giving that presentation is 5 minutes earlier, I was running up the steps at Hub Seattle for the presentation, and I fell forward into the stairs and cracked and broke the screen on my laptop. And so I had to open up that presentation after falling, and I couldn't actually, it still worked enough to project it on the screen. So I remember, and then I saw Joel Solomon for the first time in the audience, and I was like, that's Joel Solomon. And a good friend of ours, Francesca Vitor, had connected us. So I couldn't have been more disoriented starting that presentation. So I'm very happy to be in the safety of my desk and not falling up or down stairs right now as we're answering that question. But you asked the question of what is full spectrum capital? When an individual, a foundation, a donor advised fund, a company, a life insurance company, a pension fund, a family office comes to us and says, we want to do impact investing. We say, well, just to be clear, we have 4 categories. We have your governance, your philanthropy, your direct investing, and the money in the stock market. And we have over close to 100 tools across those 4 categories. What do you mean? And in many instances, I'm always wrong at where they want to start. I'll say, I know Matt, I know what he's going to say, and I'm always wrong. And in this particular instance, let's talk about a real life case study of a $1 billion foundation. They said, Stephanie, we want to do a direct investment into a nonprofit. I say, absolutely, no problem. We can help you out with that education. And I start with the conversation and say, well, what's the financial return of your $1.25 billion foundation? And or how much do you have? They said $1.25 billion. And I said, okay, what return did you get on the stock market? And this was several years ago. They said 5% return. And I said, well, how much money did you give away last year? And most people don't realize private foundations legally have to give away 5% in the form of grants, their expenditures, or program-related investments. And this particular foundation said, we give away $30 million. And I say, well, what's your financial return when you give the money away? And they say, what do you mean? It's impact. It's not an investment. And it's zero, nothing. We don't get it back. And we say, well, wouldn't it be zero if you gave $1 million grant to a school and a year later that school gave you back the $1 million? Isn't that a 0% return? Speaking of Oikocredit. And they said, yes, you're correct. I said, so when you give a grant to a school and you don't get the money back, what's that financial return? Negative? Negative what? Negative 100% loss. And what's wild is, so at Impact Finance Center, we say your philanthropy is an investment with a negative 100% financial return, attempting positive impact, and all of your investments have impact. And so to demonstrate this concept of full spectrum capital, I bring in a second case study, which is the Walton Family Foundation and Teresa Ish. And she came to us and she had a particular problem. She had nonprofits that were really entrepreneurial and they wanted grant funding from her. And she had for-profits that were really impactful and they wanted grant funding from her. And she said, I don't have enough grant funding to fund everybody in sustainable fisheries. And so we ended up developing a transaction that was a $500,000 negative 50% return investment to a for-profit sustainable seafood company that leveraged a $6 million investment. And we make the case that not only is that negative 50% investment a full spectrum capital investment, it's an above market rate return of giving your money away as a grant. And the super awesome part of this story is if you go into a company, it's not just a grant dollar that's a negative 100% loss return. It's a marketing dollar and an HR dollar and a corporate social responsibility dollar and an R&D dollar. So we're sitting around with all these buckets of negative 100% money, and we should be thinking, instead of having two blunt instruments of donations and loans and equity investments, or three instruments, we should actually have this full spectrum of capital from negative 100 to negative 90, negative 80, all the way up to market rate.
Thanks. That's a fantastic explanation. And I just want to go back for a second to that day in 2016 in Seattle. I can't believe that you had just fallen down and broken your laptop in the run up to that meeting, because you walked into that room and you were completely comfortable. You presented in a way that, it seemed like, it was just another day. And I think you've just defined for us resilience and persistence.
It's so funny because the truth of the matter is I managed to fall up the stairs versus down the stairs. So that's even more funny. But, I think for those people we were just discussing before we started recording, those people who enjoy presenting or have something they want to say and learn how to present, there's nothing better than practice, and in groups of people that will give you honest feedback, whether it's Toastmasters or an improv group or whatever you're doing. And I just am grateful for that practice that allowed me to show up in that way, because I was like, is the presentation even going to go on? So, yeah.
Well, thanks, Steph. That is helpful, as well as how you've described full spectrum capital. And I want to go back a little bit further, back to 2012. And that was when you started the Impact Finance Center. That was a few years after you earned your PhD in forestry at the University of Montana and your master's in ecology at Utah State. On a personal level, what first inspired you to focus on impact investing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. I appreciate it. When I look back at my life and I think of my dad, and when I was 12 years old, for some reason he had me invest in Micron, and I'm close to 50 years old right now. And so that was 40 years ago, pre-internet. And then when I was 12, 13 years old, he also offered me a little sidecar business to his precast concrete business. And so I don't know if I've been an MBA professor now, and when I look back over entrepreneurship and doing transactions, is that something you can teach, or is that something that's in your blood? Because my parents were divorced, I didn't spend a tremendous amount of time with my dad growing up. I somehow found the Motley Fool books and ended up buying Enron when I was a 16, 17-year-old because it was a renewable energy stock. And I grew up outside of Sun Valley, Idaho, and Haley, Idaho. And where I grew up, there was literally wars between our community members and the folks representing the endangered fish and the wolves. And so I grew up with this place of a lack of a mindset of scarcity, that there's not enough resources to manage our environment and to provide jobs. And I knew in my heart, my soul, that there was enough resources. It was a resource allocation problem. But I spent the first 10 years of my career thinking it was about the fish and the wolves, hence me going to have a career in natural resources. And I'm really fortunate in my dad's last 7 years of his life, we ended up collaborating on an affordable housing portfolio that was helping families go through medical bankruptcy and get into home ownership. And so 3.5 years before he passed at 58 years of age, he got a real estate license and a mortgage broker license. And we were living in Lander, Wyoming. And all of a sudden we could buy a $120,000 house for $5,000 to $8,000. And on the second or third house, my dad came home and he said, there's these families that are good credit risks. They just didn't have the right health insurance when they had a medical disaster. And now they're 3, 4, 5, 6 years out from going into getting into home ownership or owning a vehicle, which, as most of the people listening know, that's how you build wealth in this country, is you have to own part of an asset. And so we decided to do a lease option where we bought the house and we would say 10% of your rent will set aside as partial equity. And if the house appreciates above 10% at the end of your medical bankruptcy, we'll give you that upside. And so I can remember my dad when I was 16 or 17 saying, first I was like, I'm going to become a furniture maker, carpenter. And he said, really, architect? And I said, fine, wildlife biologist. He said, Stephanie, you have a mind for business. You should go into business, make a lot of resources, and then try to save the world. And I said, I just don't have the constitution to do that, Dad. But when we, at the end of his life, were able to collaborate, it was that moment where the light bulb went on, where I was like, okay, he's right. I do have a mind for business and transactions. And the affordable housing portfolio kind of helped me see that I could not only do good and do well, but if I really wanted to change the flow of capital to my community and my environment, I would have to roll up my sleeves and kind of dive into the financial markets.
Well, and what a great way to do that in terms of finding a market gap, a way that the market wasn't solving for or allowing people to stay in their homes, even though they had good credit and they'd run into a medical catastrophe. What then led you to start the Impact Finance Center? Why the Impact Finance Center?
Yeah, just like most people, when they discover their place in this world, all of a sudden you're sitting here with a PhD in forestry, and a dear friend in a peer leadership program, ELP, challenged me to shift my career into real estate. And I'm so grateful that she did that. And she also said I had to have the courage to quit my job. I had a great job with the federal government, with the Forest Service, who literally 15 years later is my most important client. And so I had the courage to listen to her and quit my job partially part-time, and ended up joining the Nature Conservancy in Colorado, where I purchased ranches, did conservation easements, a wetland mitigation bank. And it was like, okay, transactions. And then at a certain point, you're like, okay, I'm not going to do transactions for the rest of my life. That's not solving my problem. And so I did what my dear friend and colleague, Carl Palmer, he started Beartooth Capital Fund. I joined the Eco Products Fund. And so it's like funds, that must be how we move money at scale. And then after experience doing that, I was a professor faculty at Virginia Tech back in 2008, teaching an online environmental markets class. I got recruited back to University of Colorado in 2010 to 12, and that's where this chapter of my career really starts. And I was made assistant professor, adjoint director of the Initiative for Sustainable Real Estate Development, but also given a responsibility. The deal was that I would be able to do impact investments out of the University of Colorado Real Estate Foundation. And so I first turned on the job. They'd said, back when I was working at the private equity fund, I'd made the decision I want to teach a little bit, do a little research, and do deals for good. And they said, why didn't you apply for the job? And I said, no offense, academics is a little backwards, and I'll be in the private sector and I'll help you teach and do a little research. And they told me what I wanted, and they offered that to me. And I said, thank you, no, thank you. And I got off the phone and called them right back. And I said, oh, they offered me what I wanted. It was my absolute dream job, with the exception of the bureaucracy is really high. I mean, the overhead rate's over 50%, to just name two things. But I learned three things there. And it wasn't the real estate that was the innovation that I was working on. It was the financial innovation part. And so I just asked myself at a midlife crisis, I guess in my 30s, I said, why isn't the money moving? I've been a part of hundreds of transactions, and it's really tough. It doesn't matter if you're a project, a small business, a startup, a fund, it's really tough to raise money. And yet you look at the United States of America, we have how many millionaires in the US? Hundreds of, it must be millions and millions of millionaires. I don't know what the number is. And those people, many of them are intelligent, they have a heart, and care about making the world a better place, and they have access to money, and they are intelligent. Why isn't the money flowing to the good things? And the ahas I had were, well, number one, where do the people with the resources go to learn how to invest? They go to Wall Street. Okay, does Wall Street, do they make money or lose money when they pull it out to invest in Oikocredit or a project, a nonprofit? Oh, they lose money. Okay, they're conflicted. Okay, where's the phone book for the non-conflicted investor educators? Oh, there's really not a lot of them. Okay, we better create a whole industry of trustworthy, non-conflicted investor education. So that was number one. The number two is what we'd already discussed, full spectrum capital, the negative 100% return. And then the third piece was really key, which was when I think of what I'll say asset owners or asset stewards with a lot of resources, asking them, even if somebody with $100 million, if they've never actually done a $250,000 investment into a small business or a startup or a fund or a nonprofit, asking them to write that check without ever taking them through a training or simulation or intensive coaching. T-ball essentially is akin to Sara and Matt, the three of us, like showing up at the Seattle Mariners and starting to have to swing at 95-mile-an-hour fast pitches without ever going through T-ball. And so we're looking at these capital stewards and saying, wait, you should be investing. You have the money, the intelligence, and the alignment for mission. What's going on? Without realizing we need to put ourselves in their shoes and go, until you've done that first experience, that second experience, you're not going to be able to get up to the major leagues. And so, long story short, I had this sinking feeling. There's about 15 centers in financial innovation impact investing back in 2012. And I don't know, Matt and Sara, how many entrepreneurship centers do you think there are in the world?
I would say a bunch if you count accelerators.
So I would say probably that, if you count hundreds, thousands, a lot. And there's 15. So the entrepreneurship centers and the accelerators are building one side of the marketplace. Like, these are the folks that need the capital. And there's 15 centers educating the money to invest in the entrepreneurs. And I remember thinking, that's a problem. Every entrepreneurship center needs an innovative finance center, or at least the curriculum. And if there's only 15, we're not going to scale to hundreds and thousands. So let me leave the University of Colorado, form a nonprofit, and be an academic center that's a multi-university academic center that not only can partner with any university, but then you take a step back and you're like, wait, the universities themselves need financial innovation centers to keep their organizations alive. And then you realize all types of money, whether it's individual money and Tiger 21 or YPO or foundations and a philanthropic supporting org or community foundations, there's all these memberships of money, and each one of them needs this education. So the only way we can get this to scale is that several folks like all of us join together to create the business to business to consumer model to get that education and figure out how to partner with those associations or clubs of money.
Stephanie, I've really loved hearing your story and kind of where you came from and, who you thought you were or what you thought you wanted to do, and especially your dad's advice. It made me realize that you and I have more overlap in our backgrounds than I think I realized. I have an undergrad in natural resource management, and I worked in wildlife biology for the Forest Service. And I was about this close to getting my PhD in forestry when I went into international development finance. So also took kind of a far direction when I realized it was never about the environment. It was a lot more about the people and the economic incentives. So you've now been with, the Impact Finance Center for 10 years. What's an accomplishment that makes you the most proud?
Oh, that's a great question. And Sarah, before I answer that question, one of the things that makes me personally most proud is I actually had the great fortune to do my PhD with Dr. Jack Ward-Thomas, who was the chief of the Forest Service and led the spotted owl issue in the Pacific Northwest. And I can say this now because he and my mom both passed of pancreatic cancer, but we would all go up to University of Montana to work with Dr. Thomas, but his amazing wife is Kathy Thomas, and she was senior executive level service 5, the equivalent of a 3-star general. So she started as a secretary and kind of retired larger than Jack in some ways, but she was the deputy chief of the Forest Service for administration, and she just flew out last week for our strategic planning meeting. So she's retired now and kind of getting back in it. And I really appreciate Jack as a PhD advisor, because when I joined the PhD program, he said, Stephanie, we don't need you to learn another natural resource class. And so I think I have one class in forestry for my PhD. He's like, I want you to take communications and social science and econ. And right before he passed, I remember he joked with me. He said, you do tell people I taught you everything I know, you know, right? And he wasn't following everything we were doing, but it's come full circle, because we're now one of our biggest clients and projects is working with the federal government, the US Forest Service, and they called us and they said, Steph, there's this little fire problem out west, and there's this new technology that can take this small wood and you can glue it together into a wood beam, and it's as strong and amazing as concrete and steel, and that you can now build skyscrapers and buildings out of this. And maybe with your magic box of financial tools and this magic box of mass timber CLT, we can all of a sudden provide the financial incentive to actually do the restoration of the forest to reduce the fire risk, provide good jobs, and have a carbon solution in this way. So I love that that's your background, Sarah, from that perspective. When I look back at the last 9 years, it's almost 10, and I think that I'm really proud mainly of our team who backed me to say, instead of doing some safe consulting, let's create a double-sided marketplace at a state level, which is called Colorado Impact Days. And really some good friends, David Wood from Harvard and program officer Robin from Kresge, she's no longer there, came out to Colorado, and they did a workshop back in 2015 and basically said, we didn't have investor-ready transactions. We had a capital absorption problem. And the upside of losing your parents in their 50s is, for me, it gave me the permission to take a lot more risk of saying, I don't want to get to be 56 and wish I would have gone for it more. And so it completely shifted how I was able to show up in the world. And so I was 41, I was single without kids. And I was like, let's go prove them wrong. Let's prove that there's good things to invest in Colorado. So I teased David that he was the inspiration for my stubborn persistence. And we called together a steering committee of lovely people like yourself. And like, are there good things to invest in Colorado that are investor ready? And everyone's like, yes, let's do it. Now, I will say I kind of let the steering committee's scope creep. And next thing you know, we're doing 70 education events of different PowerPoint presentations. And I'm maxed out my credit cards. I've signed a hotel contract for, 150 to 250,000. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my house. And we ended up saying, who needs money? And did a 3-day education event now known as Impact Days, or the first one was Colorado Impact Days. We're actually in conversations about doing one in California Impact Days. And we ended up over 3 years doing 200 education events. We sourced over 600 investments. we activated 85, now we're up to 155 investors. And just by bringing good, beautiful people together to meet good, beautiful other people, you can imagine a farmer's market of social ventures. We've counted well over $350 million of investment. And when I look back I can remember thinking, wow, 100 million, that's insane. We'll be lucky to get to 20, and I'll be proud if we get to 40. So to see that flow happen, and especially to continue happening beyond us, is super exciting. And we need hundreds of more people and organizations focusing on activating new investors, because once you get them activated, I saw 2 of them last week, they're on their 35th investment, and so it's a heavy, hard lift to take somebody from I am curious, I'm thinking about doing this, to doing their first thing. But certainly proving that we could create that double-sided marketplace, and the team that was willing to follow us into the dark forest was amazing.
Well, it sounds like you went into that dark forest, but managed to come out through the other side with $350 million in facilitated impact, which is tremendous. You have along the way garnered grant funding from leading foundations in the impact investing field. Why have they supported the Impact Finance Center, and what have you been able to do with their funding?
That's a great question, Matt. When we started off, we were 100% supported by donations and foundations. And I remember Lisa Davis, who's now at PGM. She's at Prudential, PGIM, I believe. And she invested in us because she saw the work we were doing was bringing together the practitioner community, working, especially she was focused on transit-oriented development and the real estate community. And she said, you have an incredible business community in Colorado, and an incredible practitioner community, and they're disconnected. And here I was, a professor at University of Colorado, working with these amazing MBA students that were doing skits, White Guys for Equity, and just completely transformed by the idea that there's this other bucket of money out there that if they use full spectrum capital, they can get their financial returns and have all these amazing social and sustainability goals met at the same time. And I think that, when you find really thoughtful, good funders, and want to be thankful to John Baldock at MacArthur and others, they see what you're doing and want to show up and support that world in a profoundly interesting way. I haven't looked at to see what happened last year to be able to tell you what part of us is philanthropically supported versus more earned revenue, but it's got to be, we're almost, I wouldn't be surprised if we're 50 to 75% earned revenue. So I think the importance of the local donors and the foundations at the statewide level and national level to basically take a bet on a human being and an idea and give them the runway to innovate and pilot several pieces of what I'd call community infrastructure is incredible. And we need a lot more people taking bets. Especially, I love the direct impact of what so many organizations provide, but there's those of us sitting back at the systems level, and that's a really tough business model to crack. And so I'm super grateful for Ford, MacArthur, Packard, all of them over the time that have shown up and supported us, as well as our statewide foundations like Gary Community Ventures and Colorado Health Foundation and the Anschutz Foundation.
So one of your latest initiatives at IFC is to convene impact investing clubs along with various themes and geographic preference or location of investors. How are these going, and what's in it for the people looking to align their investments with their values?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. Right. I remember when the 3-year pilot ended, it was probably about 8 months before the pandemic started. And isn't it funny that we'll always be talking pre and post pandemic? And we have a really great group of CDFIs and nonprofit lenders in Colorado, and if you don't know what a CDFI is, it's a community financial development institution. And so I think of it as kind of where, if the banking system isn't serving certain people, especially low-income people, people of color, women, indigenous communities, this kind of shadow system was created by the federal government to help serve those communities. but we have to go raise the capital for them to do the investment. And historically, that money has come from banks, essentially, that have to essentially get penalized for not opening up branches in those locations, have given money, as well as the federal government. Well, in Colorado, we were able to start really helping increase the flow of capital in the rate that the organizations needed. And so we pair grants with loans or grants with endowment investments. And so now when I meet an organization like a lender, I say, well, what's the ratio of grants you need versus loans, the money to lend out, but also the money, I'm sure Oikos is the same way, to pay for your operating expenses, your loan loss reserve, your technical assistance. And I love the ones we work with closely is Oikocredit Corporation. They're the largest native CDFI lender. And when I asked them what that ratio was, they're like, we need $25 of grants for every $75 of loans, because they're serving, close to 70, 69, 70 native CDFIs throughout the country. That ratio of math, it turns out for every $100, it's a negative 24% return, which sounds horrible until you shift your mindset around full spectrum capital and realize a negative 24% return is help me out with this, 76% increase to a marketing dollar, a grant dollar, a CSR, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we ended the 3-year pilot, and that's how it was designed to be, the CDFIs and nonprofit lenders said, you can't stop meeting. You got to you can be activating investors in Colorado and getting the money flowing. So I said, well, we're not an investment banker. We don't get a fee on this. Like, there's flow. We have to figure out the business model around this. And I said, but since 4 of you have called, or 3 or 4 of you have called, what if we do a bodega instead of a full statewide marketplace per state? Why don't we just do the subset? And so we'll do a mini marketplace or a bodega, and we'll call it an investor club. And so the first one was the Colorado Main Street Investor Club. And I believe we have 12 going. Some are national, like indigenous and sustainable forestry. Some are statewide. We have Massachusetts, we have California. We're just going to start California forests. And we have the New York CDFIs. And, Sara, they range from successes. It takes, it's like paddling a iceberg flippers on. You have to paddle really hard to get the iceberg going, and the momentum happens. So Oikocredit historically in 25 years had raised $79 million and lent it out with one partial default of less of $4,000. Last year, we did 3 events with them, and there's a confluence of amazing events in this country, and they raised $27 million. And so what we do with the investor clubs is they're just virtual farmers markets. And so we find investments that need capital, and we find investors that are willing to show up and publicly attract other investors and share their stories. And now we have a whole back-end data team and are implementing essentially a investor qualification tool. So some of the sustainable forestry, unlike indigenous, has taken a full year to get their first investments flowing, but I think there's 2 to 10 in process right now. So we end up with, for an event, 50 to 500 investor prospects. You end up with the social ventures, and then we're working right now to basically get that qualification process going. And so we're quickly building the largest impact investor database in the country, if not the world.
Steph, I'm imagining a graphic history of the Impact Finance Center, and somewhere along the way, there's someone paddling an iceberg with a paddle, and also there's a bunch of bodegas. The imagery here is really quite palpable. As you know from Realize Impact, where we're on the board, interest is growing exponentially in recoverable grants, or what Realize Impact calls philanthropic impact grants. And already this year, Realize Impact has raised nearly $4 million in those grants, of which it's deployed nearly $3 million through investments in enterprises that are having a positive social or environmental impact. And at the same time, there's growing pressure on providers of donor-advised funds like Fidelity Charitable, Vanguard Charitable, and community foundations to help facilitate more recoverable grants. What's your take on the rise of recoverable grants, and what's your outlook on them for the next 1 to 2 years?
Well, I think that's a great question. I certainly wouldn't be on the board and investment committee of Realize Impact if I didn't believe in this. And we should also give a shout out to Looney Libis, who is the architect behind Realize Impact. And there's a whole crew of 10 or 12 of us that keep innovating on what I'd call community infrastructure. And sometimes it makes money, sometimes it breaks even, sometimes we have to volunteer to stand it up like we have with Realize Impact. But when you think about it, you have these intermediaries, which are, it doesn't matter if it's a private foundation or a community foundation with a donor advised fund or a nonprofit that provides a donor advised fund. They're getting more and more people coming to them saying, hey, I want to take that money and not just do grants, but I want to do loans, revenue-based financing, equity investments to not just nonprofits, but for-profits and projects and funds. And so, and the business model of that world is kind of broken. There's not a ton of money in fees the way it's set up. And so it kind of puts those organizations, puts their back up against the wall. And so kudos to Looney to architecting the solution, because if you're a donor advised fund provider, you don't have excess fee. You don't want to raise the fees. You don't have to pay for the expertise that you don't have on staff. You don't want to become a bank, and because if there's defaults, you don't want to go after this. And even though it's legal since 1969 to take money in, if you're a private foundation to invest in a for-profit, but a public charity, you have more flexibility in doing this. You're nervous about expenditure responsibility. And so what's great about Realize Impact is you just make the donation as an individual, donor advised fund, and foundation into Realize Impact. And it's a $500 fee if the transaction's over $10,000. And we make the investment on your behalf as a public charity. We have been to this point close to like 100% volunteer. And then if any of the money comes back, we return 99% of it back to your donor advised fund, private foundation, or public charity of your choice. I think that that's like a iceberg with paddling with flippers on. We started with the Seattle Foundation with our master service agreement, and now we have the Community Foundation of Utah that started with the master service agreement. And I think not 20 to 25 donor advised fund providers in our first year, and that was largely a whisper campaign. But it's definitely going to. I don't know when it's going to really click, but I would say maybe, I don't know, 10 to 15, 20 of those more master service agreements, and I think it'll take off like other things have taken off.
Well, that's good to hear, Steph. I certainly hope so. Just in our last 60 seconds, one last quick question. Our first interview of this alignment series was with author Janine Firpo, whom you know. Her book, Activate Your Money, outlines how people can align all of their assets with their values, from their bank accounts to their 401k. What advice would you give to people who want to learn more about impact investing? How can they get started?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the services we provided during the pandemic is we took those 200 PowerPoint presentations, different ones we've given. I think we've recorded 80 of them already up on our Impact Investing Institute. So if people want to reach out to us, and if you can pay a few bucks, that's great. If you need a free code, let us know. And you are welcome to come and watch. It's not only our content, we've had guests like Looney Libis up, and he has a great series called California Capitalism Part 1 and Part 2. But there are tons of fragmented education providers in this space. We have Mission Investors Exchange, we have Tonic, we have Seattle Impact Investing Group, we have Confluence Philanthropy, we have GIN. Find a friend to go through the education journey with you, and go figure out some of these resources, and just it's hard. Like, let's be clear. I told somebody the other day, a client, I said, I'm glad you like backcountry skiing. We're your backcountry ski guide. We're gonna get bumps, we're gonna get stuck, we're gonna fall. But I've been down this mountain 10 times before, and if we go through it together, we'll get to the bottom of it. So just know that you're going to have to have an attitude of a backcountry skier to get down the other side of the mountain.
Love it. Thank you, Steph. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and to those of you who sent in questions. And thank you, Steph, for joining us in this series of interviews we're calling Alignment: Using Your Values to Invest in Social Change.
Please join us at the same time on Wednesday, October 27th for our next interview in the Alignment series. How do you know if your impact investment is having impact? Find out the answer when we talk with Jane Reisman, an expert in impact measurement.
This webinar series is made possible by generous donations from people like you. You can also invest in Oikocredit's impact through our recoverable grant program. To learn more about Oikocredit US or how to support our mission to improve living standards in low-income countries, visit our website at oikocreditus.org. Until next time, on behalf of Sara and me and everyone at Oikocredit US, thanks for your support. See you soon.